Ice doesn't ask permission before it moves, and out past the Kestrel Strait, in the waters my crew and I fish for snow crab every winter season, it can close a lead of open water half a mile wide in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee in the galley. I've been reading pack ice for 21 years, first as a deckhand on my father's boat, then for the last 9 as captain of my own vessel, the Northern Vale, and I've learned that the difference between a good season and a boat lost with everyone aboard usually comes down to trusting your own eyes over whatever a screen is telling you, especially when that screen is telling you something is happening right now that actually happened 40 minutes ago. My name is Kaya Halvorsen. I'm one of 11 captains fishing under my mother's company's banner out of Sandhaven, and for the last 2 years, my mother, Solveig, has run the fleet's shoreside digital operations division, the division that built and championed a satellite-fed navigation system called PolarSync, installed aboard every vessel in our fleet including my own. This is a story about my mother, about a system she genuinely believed in, and about a night in February when the gap between what PolarSync's ice overlay showed on my bridge display and what the ice was actually doing 40 minutes later nearly put the Northern Vale and her 5-man crew directly into a closing lead of pack ice with no clean way back out. PolarSync came aboard the fleet 3 years ago, a satellite-linked navigation and routing platform designed to overlay real-time sea ice imagery, swell data, and optimal transit routing directly onto each vessel's bridge display, replacing a patchwork of separately consulted ice charts, weather forecasts, and captain's intuition that had governed fleet navigation since before I was born. My mother had championed the system from its earliest pilot phase, arguing, correctly, that 11 captains each independently reading ice charts updated only twice daily was leaving both fuel efficiency and genuine safety margin on the table, when a single, continuously updated system could show every vessel in the fleet the same current picture at once. PolarSync satellite feed refreshes continuously, Kaya, she told me, more than once, across a kitchen table in Sandhaven I've been eating dinner at since I was a girl. You're not looking at yesterday's ice chart anymore, you're looking at what the ice is doing right now, and that's a genuine safety improvement over what any of us grew up navigating with. I don't disagree, the system's usually faster than a twice-daily paper chart, Mom. What I'm telling you is that, continuously updated isn't the same thing as instantaneous, and up past the Kestrel Strait, when the satellite link's congested, I've watched that display hold a picture steady for a lot longer than the ice itself actually holds steady. I want to be fair to what PolarSync actually got right, in the same way I'd want anyone to be fair to a company my own grandfather founded with 2 boats and a hand-drawn chart, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a mother who stopped caring about the men and women working her family's boats the moment she moved into an office overlooking the harbor instead of standing on a deck. PolarSync's routing had measurably cut average transit fuel costs across the fleet for 3 straight seasons, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering my mother had built her entire second career on after her own knees finally gave out from 26 years of deck work, and I never once doubted she believed in it completely. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of disclosing plainly, was any prominent way to show a captain, in the moment, exactly how old the ice imagery on her screen actually was, when the satellite feed's refresh could lag by as much as 45 minutes during the kind of heavy northern latitude satellite congestion that happened, with some regularity, precisely during the worst winter weather, which was of course exactly the weather in which, knowing the true, current position of closing ice mattered most. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that February night, and because it's exactly the kind of quietly buried technical limitation a system marketed around the word real-time was never built to foreground clearly enough for the person standing on a rolling bridge deck at 2 in the morning to fully weigh. PolarSync's ice imagery came from a low Earth orbit satellite constellation passing over our fishing grounds on a roughly 90-minute revisit cycle under good conditions, stitched together on the bridge display into what looked, to anyone glancing at it, like a single continuously live picture. Under normal satellite link conditions, that stitching kept the displayed imagery within perhaps 10 or 12 minutes of true current, close enough that the difference rarely mattered even to a captain reading ice as carefully as I did. But during heavy weather, when the same storm systems that made ice navigation most dangerous also degraded the satellite uplink's bandwidth, PolarSync's own buffering logic would silently extend how long it held the most recent successfully received imagery on screen before flagging it as stale, a design choice made, I later learned, specifically to avoid the display flickering distractingly blank during exactly the kind of rough conditions when a captain most needed an uninterrupted picture. In front of her, the system did display a small timestamp in the corner of the ice overlay, technically accurate, technically available to anyone who looked closely enough to check it against the ship's own clock, but the overlay's visual framing, a solid, confident, continuously rendered ice edge rather than any kind of degrading or uncertain-looking display, communicated a confidence the underlying data, 40 minutes old in the worst conditions, didn't actually warrant. I'd caught that exact gap myself 18 months earlier, on a different transit, noticing the ice edge on my display sitting suspiciously still for nearly half an hour of hard following wind, conditions I knew from 2 decades of experience would be actively pushing pack ice, and I'd slowed the northern veil on my own judgment that night, only to watch, once the satellite link cleared, the display's ice edge jump nearly a third of a mile closer to where I'd already independently guessed it had drifted. I'd raised this specific gap with my mother nearly a year before this story's events, sitting in her office above the Sandhaven harbor, describing that 18-month-old close call as clearly as I could. The timestamp's right there in the corner, Kaya. Any captain checking it against ship's time can see exactly how current the imagery is. I don't think the system's hiding anything from anyone paying attention. It's not hidden, Mom, it's just not prominent. And there's a real difference between the two at 2 in the morning in a following sea, when you're trusting the picture in front of you because it looks solid and confident and current, and you've got about 4 other instruments and a radar screen also demanding your attention at the exact same moment. I want a visible, unmissable staleness warning on that overlay whenever the lag crosses a real threshold, not a small timestamp buried in a corner that assumes I've got the spare attention to go checking it constantly. I'll take it to the engineering team as a design request, but I can't have you telling every captain in the fleet to distrust a system that's genuinely improved our safety record over 3 seasons, based on one close call that you yourself caught and handled correctly. I remember driving back out to the harbor that afternoon still turning her answer over, understanding exactly where she was standing even as I disagreed with the conclusion she'd reached from there. My mother had spent 26 years on deck before her knees gave out, and I knew, better than almost anyone, how many of those years she'd spent watching captains, my own father among them, make calls on instinct alone that had occasionally gone badly wrong in ways instinct alone couldn't have prevented. She wasn't wrong that a consistent, continuously updated system beat 11 captains each reading their own chart at their own pace, and I'd never once told her otherwise, in that meeting or any other. What I couldn't get her to fully sit with that afternoon was the specific, narrower claim I was actually making, that a system built to feel reassuringly solid even while running 40 minutes behind true conditions was quietly asking every captain in the fleet to trust its confidence over their own, at precisely the moments when that confidence was least earned. The night this story turns on was the second week of February, the Northern Vale running a loaded transit back towards Sandhaven through the Kestrel Strait after a strong opening week of the season, a following storm system pushing hard weather in behind us and degrading, as it always did, the satellite uplink bandwidth across the entire fleet. Polar Sync's ice overlay showed a stable, well-defined lead of open water running the length of our planned transit route, the same route the system's own routing engine had recommended that afternoon based on the most recent clean imagery it had received before the storm began degrading the link. I was on the bridge at 1:30 in the morning, my first mate Dag at the helm, watching the ice overlay's confident, solid rendered lead of open water sitting directly ahead of us, when I noticed something that pulled at the same specific unease I'd felt 18 months earlier. The ice edge on the display hadn't shifted position in nearly 35 minutes of hard following wind, exactly the kind of wind that, in 21 years of reading this exact stretch of water, I knew moved pack ice measurably within that window, storm or no storm. I checked the overlay's timestamp in the corner, the number I'd specifically fought to have made more visible a year earlier and that Polar Sync's engineering team had, to their credit, moved to a slightly larger font since. It read 38 minutes old, comfortably within what the system's own documentation described as an acceptable buffering window during degraded satellite conditions, and technically, by every metric Polar Sync tracked, still well inside normal operating parameters. Dag, kill our speed by a third and get the searchlight on the ice edge dead ahead. I don't like how still that lead's been sitting on the display for the length of this wind. The system still showing clear water the whole run to the straight mouth, Captain. We're inside Polar Sync's own acceptable lag window. This is standard buffering during weather, not an alert condition. I know exactly what window we're inside, Dag. I helped write the request for that window myself, and I'm telling you a following gale doesn't respect a company's acceptable buffering threshold, so we're slowing down and confirming visually before we run this vessel into anything that displays 38 minutes behind on. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell partly within my formal authority as master of the Northern Vale and partly, honestly, outside the specific routing Polar Sync's own dashboard had cleared for that transit. Under fleet safety protocol, any vessel's captain held absolute, non-overridable authority over navigation decisions regardless of what any shoreside system recommended, an authority written into every captain's contract specifically to preserve exactly this kind of override. But exercising it against a system 3 seasons of clean data had made the whole fleet increasingly comfortable. Trusting still meant slowing a loaded vessel, in hard weather, on nothing more concrete than a stubborn feeling about how still a line on a screen had been sitting. I brought the Northern Vale down to a slow, careful crawl, put the searchlight and both radar sets on the ice edge. Polar Sync's display still confidently showed as a full third of a mile distant, and felt the particular stretched, waiting quiet that settles over a bridge deck when a captain has just overridden a system 3 seasons of clean data have made everyone comfortable trusting, and hasn't yet learned whether she's right. Dag kept his hands steady on the wheel, but I noticed him glancing between the display's still confident open water and the darkness beyond the searchlight's reach more than once in those 4 minutes, the particular look of a man who trusted his captain completely and still couldn't quite make his own eyes stop checking the screen that had never once been wrong across 3 seasons of runs exactly like this one. Within 4 minutes, I watched the actual pack ice edge emerge out of the driving snow directly off our bow, considerably closer than the display's stale imagery had shown, a genuine convergence of drifting flows that had closed most of the gap the system still displayed as open water, exactly the kind of closing lead that could trap a loaded vessel against pack ice with no clean way to reverse course fast enough in a following sea. Ice dead ahead, Captain, maybe 200 yards, closer than anything on the display. Dag's voice had lost every trace of the routine confidence it had carried 3 minutes earlier, replaced by the particular flat calm I recognized from 21 years of exactly this kind of moment. I brought the Northern Vale hard to port, threading a genuinely open channel my radar confirmed still existed roughly half a mile east of Polar Sync's recommended route, adding nearly 90 minutes to our transit back into Sandhaven but keeping 5 tons of loaded crab pots and a 5-man crew clear of an ice convergence the system's own display, technically inside its acceptable lag window the entire time, had never once flagged as anything other than routine. My mother met the Northern Vale at the Sandhaven dock herself the following morning, having pulled Polar Sync's full satellite log and cross-referenced it against my own transit report the moment word reached the office that I'd diverted a loaded vessel nearly 90 minutes off the system's recommended route in the middle of a storm. I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with the satellite log's own buffering data sitting in hard numbers in front of both our eyes. 38 minutes of lag inside a technically acceptable window, Kaya. That's not the system failing, that's the system working exactly as designed, and you diverted a loaded vessel on a feeling about how still a line looked. The line looked still because it was 38 minutes old, Mom, and in that specific wind, in that specific stretch of water, 38 minutes was more than enough time for the ice to close a lead I'd have run us straight into if I'd trusted the display the way 3 seasons of clean data have quietly been training every captain in this fleet to trust it. I've been telling you for a year that, technically acceptable and actually safe in this exact weather, in this exact place aren't always the same threshold, and I didn't have anything beyond one old close call to prove it until last night made the gap impossible to keep deferring. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe a year ago, when you first raised it. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Kaya. I built this whole system because I spent 26 years on deck watching captains, including your father, make navigation calls on instinct that occasionally cost this fleet vessels I still think about. I wanted a version of this job that didn't depend so entirely on any one captain's instinct being right every single time, and I think I let that wanting run further ahead of what the engineering could actually guarantee than I should have. I know that, Mom. I'm not angry at you for wanting something steadier than instinct alone. I grew up on this fleet too. I remember exactly which boats we lost and why. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, a system confident enough to show a solid, unbroken ice edge on screen, even while technically inside its own disclosed lag window, was asking every captain in this fleet to trust a picture that wasn't true anymore, and the only reason the Northern Vale isn't sitting in that lead this morning is that I've spent 21 years learning not to fully trust any single picture, however solid it looks. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out past the dock at the grey water where the Northern Vale sat riding low with the season's catch, and I watched her run the same calculation I imagined she'd been running since my transit report crossed her desk, the particular operator's math of how many other transits, across 3 storm seasons and 11 vessels, might have carried the same invisible lag gap without one stubborn captain's 21 years of reading this exact water happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of last night where Dag talked you out of slowing down, she said, finally, or the version where you'd stopped pushing me about that timestamp a year ago, because I outranked the argument on paper even if I never outranked it on the water. I don't like sitting with how much of last night came down to you personally deciding not to let it go the first time I said no. I don't love sitting with that either, Mom. A system this good shouldn't need one stubborn captain's memory of a bad afternoon 18 months ago as its last line of defense before a loaded vessel runs into ice it can't see. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 3 seasons, and I've never once told this crew otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as finished, and I think somewhere in the last year you let yourself believe it was closer to finished than the engineering itself actually supported. The Northern Vale finished out the season without further incident, and what my mother and I built together over the following months, working with Polar Sync's engineering team directly, was a genuinely visible degraded confidence display mode, triggered automatically whenever satellite lag crossed a threshold tied to current wind speed rather than a single fixed number, rendering the ice overlay itself with a visibly uncertain, softened edge during exactly the conditions when a confident solid line was most likely to be dangerously wrong, closing the exact gap that had let 3 clean storm seasons of otherwise excellent engineering train an entire fleet to trust a picture more than the specific weather in front of them ever fully warranted. I still slow the Northern Vale on a feeling some nights, considerably less often now that the display itself finally shows its own uncertainty honestly rather than asking a captain to remember to go checking a small timestamp in a corner during the exact conditions when she has the least spare attention to spend doing it. Dag still brings up that February night occasionally, over coffee in the wheelhouse, the particular 90-minute diversion neither of us has ever needed to explain twice to anyone who's since heard the full story. My mother and I talk about Polar Sync's ongoing refinement most Sundays now, over the same kitchen table I grew up eating dinner at, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that February storm. She told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the engineering fix at all, it was sitting with how completely 3 clean seasons had let her believe a technically disclosed lag window was the same thing as a genuinely safe one, right up until her own daughter's stubborn insistence on trusting 21 years of reading one particular stretch of ice finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. Ice doesn't ask permission before it moves, and what I've learned, watching a system my own mother built get this one thing wrong for a full year before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one hiding inside language like acceptable, and, within normal parameters, language that's entirely true and entirely capable of getting a loaded vessel and a 5-man crew trapped against pack ice in a following storm at 2 in the morning. It took a 38-minute-old picture, a 90-minute diversion, and a mother and daughter who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a dock in the grey morning light, to finally close a gap that 3 otherwise excellent storm seasons had never quite found their way to on their own.